March 3rd, 1943, somewhere over the Bismarck Sea. The altimeter needle is barely above zero. A B-25 Mitchell thunders just a few dozen feet over white-capped water, the sea so close the spray looks like it's reaching up to grab the wings. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's boots vibrate against the floor, engines wide open, every gauge on the panel trembling just shy of the red. The entire airplane buzzes with strain and noise. Ahead, the horizon is broken by dark shapes and gun flashes. A Japanese convoy, transports and destroyers locked in formation, wrapped in black puffs of flak and orange bursts. Every ship seems to be firing at once, trying to build a wall of metal between itself and the incoming attackers. "Coming up on the lead ship," the co-pilot shouts, though his voice is almost lost in the roar of engines and the deeper rattle of 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. Those guns are the reason this plane exists. Where a normal B-25 carries a glass nose and a bombardier hunched over a sight, this one has a solid metal snout stuffed with heavy Brownings, 8 of them, all pointing straight ahead. The front of the airplane is nothing but gun barrels, ammo cans, cables, and brackets. No one back at the factory ever signed off on this. On paper, the design was too nose-heavy, too violent, too likely to rip itself apart when all the guns opened up. Yet here it is, racing at wave-top height straight at a Japanese transport. In the windscreen, the ship swells from a gray smudge into a real target. Bow wave, bridge, gun tubs, tiny figures moving on deck. Japanese gunners are already spraying tracers, red and green lines slashing past the nose. The Mitchell bucks in their wake, skidding slightly as gusts and near misses rock the airframe. The pilot can't afford to blink. In just a few seconds, he has to ride this impossible gunship through the fire, hose down the decks with his forward guns, drop his bombs low enough to bounce them off the sea like stones, and then yank the entire aircraft away before the blast reaches him. It's the kind of attack that sounded like madness in a briefing room. Somewhere in that armored nose, behind those jury-rigged guns, is the shadow of an idea from a stubborn, grease-stained engineer named Paul "Pappy" Gunn. An idea that over the course of 3 brutal days will help erase 12 Japanese ships from the map. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea didn't begin with that one screaming pass over the waves. It started months earlier, far from the spray and flak, on maps and supply charts, spread across dusty tables in Australia and New Guinea. In early 1943, the Allies in the Southwest Pacific were still playing catch-up. They couldn't strike at Japan itself yet. Their war was about short, savage fights in jungles and along coastlines, and about the narrow seas that fed those front lines. The waters between Rabaul, New Britain, and the north coast of New Guinea were a supply highway for the Japanese army. Every Japanese soldier, crate of ammunition, and barrel of fuel headed for New Guinea had to cross that highway in ships. If those convoys got through, Japanese positions at places like Leh and Salamaua stayed dangerous. If they didn't, those positions withered. On paper, the answer was simple: bomb the convoys. In reality, the results were disappointing. Standard doctrine called for medium and heavy bombers to attack from several thousand feet up. B-17s and regular B-25s cruised in at 7,000 to 10,000 feet, bomb bay doors open, dropping neat strings of bombs on moving specks far below. Against fixed targets, airfields, docks, warehouses, this could be ugly and effective. Against ships that could turn, speed up, slow down, and throw up a cloud of flak, it wasn't enough. Captains watched bombs fall, waited until the last possible moment, then yanked their ships into hard turns. Near misses sent great columns of water skyward, but left steel hulls intact. Reconnaissance photos told the story. Time after time, convoys that should have been shattered still counted too many ships afloat. Japanese transports took hits. A few were sunk. A destroyer might limp away with its bow low. But enough ships usually survived to unload their cargoes of men and equipment on New Guinea's shores. Allied air crews risked themselves on long missions over featureless water, only to watch their bombs walk harmlessly across empty ocean. Something had to change. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, understood that more clearly than anyone. He wasn't interested in repeating the same tactics and hoping for better luck. He wanted a new weapon, a way to attack ships where they were strongest, yet least protected, low, close, and fast. He pictured a medium bomber that didn't drift overhead, but slammed in just above the waves. Guns running, bombs released so low they skipped off the surface and punched into hulls at the waterline. To do that, he needed an airplane that could slug its way right down a convoy's throat and still fly home. That problem landed in the lap of one of the oddest and most valuable assets in the theater, Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Pappy Gunn's war was fought in hangars as much as in the sky. By 1942, you could usually find him in some hot corner of an Australian air depot, surrounded by half-disassembled aircraft. His uniform was more oil stains than fabric. Officially, he was an engineering officer. Unofficially, he was the one man everyone brought their crazy ideas to. Gunn didn't just fix planes, he upgraded them. He looked at factory-fresh designs and saw blank canvases. His favorite question, asked with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, was, "What if we make it meaner?" He'd already tested that philosophy on the A-20 Havoc, packing extra .50 caliber guns into its nose and turning it into a nasty, low-level strafer. The modified A-20s came back with paint, scorched off their noses and gun barrels glowing, but the crews loved them. They could shred barges, trucks, and airstrips in a way stock aircraft couldn't. So when Kenney went hunting for a commerce destroyer to tear up shipping, Gunn's eyes settled on the B-25 Mitchell. It had range, a decent bomb load, and a reputation for being tough. It also had a roomy nose that, in his mind, was wasted on glass and a bombardier's bench. The first conversion looked like something between genius and madness. Gunn's men stripped off the glazed nose and replaced it with a metal shell. They started with 4 .50 cal Brownings up front, then 6, eventually 8, all pointing forward. Ammo boxes were jammed into every spare corner, belts of ammunition curved through homemade chutes, cables were rerouted, space that had once held a bombardier now held firepower. They yanked out the belly turret and other equipment to save weight, but when the modified Mitchell sat on the runway, it still looked like it wanted to fall on its face. From some angles, it seemed to be leaning toward its own nose, eager to jump. The first time they fired all the guns at once, it almost destroyed itself. On a remote strip, Gunn lined up on a practice target and squeezed the trigger. The forward guns erupted in a continuous blast. Inside, the entire nose shook so hard it blurred. Outside, rivets around the gun mounts popped and panels visibly vibrated. A crewman watching from the ground swore the airplane's nose dipped like a boxer taking a punch. When word of the experiment reached stateside engineers, their judgment was harsh. On paper, this version of the B-25 was unbalanced, overstressed, and dangerous. Too much weight and recoil up front, too much strain on the airframe. It was stamped, unofficially at least, as impossible. But Japanese convoys weren't waiting for a perfect design. Each week brought new reports. Another convoy spotted, another conventional attack, more near misses, more enemy troops landing, more fighting ahead for ground forces already stretched thin. Gunn looked at the rattling prototype, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and decided that impossible just meant the work wasn't finished. The fix wasn't elegant, it was practical. Gunn and the depot crews treated the B-25 itself as the drawing board. They reinforced the skin around the nose and gun mounts. They added blast tubes so the muzzle flash and gas wouldn't chew up propeller blades. They stiffened internal structures that had flexed too much. They checked every line of rivets that had shown cracks and doubled up where they had to. Then they started shifting weight. Radios, batteries, and other internal gear were moved rearward. Some armor went aft. They experimented with ballast until the airplane's center of gravity crept back towards something safe. Each tweak meant a new test flight, a new firing run, and tense faces on the ground, watching to see whether the Mitchell would hold together. Bit by bit, it did. The shuddering didn't vanish, but it became manageable. The nose no longer tried to yank itself toward the ground when the guns fired. The modified B-25 still felt brutal, but it felt like an airplane again, rather than a barely controlled explosion. When Kenny came to inspect the finished product, he wasn't greeted by a sleek bomber. He saw a blunt, ugly nose bristling with barrels, ammo runs snaking through the interior, and a cockpit built for a pilot who would be his own bombardier. It didn't look like the airplanes in recruiting posters. It looked like a weapon someone had built in a hurry because losing wasn't an option. Kenny approved it on the spot. He authorized the conversion of a dozen B-25s, enough to turn a whole squadron into ship killers. The 90th Bomb Squadron began training with their new identity as low-level strike specialists. They learned to fly down on the deck, tracing the sea's surface, guns ready, practicing the timing of skip bombing on hulks and harbor wrecks. Come in at wave top height, fire first to suppress the gunners, release the bombs just far enough out that they skip once or twice and slam into the hull above the waterline. Then climb like your life depends on it, because it does. Not everybody believed in it. Pilots used to level bombing called it crazy, but the men who flew the modified Mitchells and the commanders who needed convoys, Sunk understood that crazy and necessary were about to become the same thing. All they needed now was a target big enough to justify the gamble. That target appeared at the end of February 1943. Large convoy leaving Rabaul. The message hit operations centers like a flare. Reconnaissance flights confirmed it. 8 Japanese transports, 8 destroyers as escort, loaded with thousands of troops, artillery, vehicles, and supplies, all bound for Leh on the north coast of New Guinea. If they made it, the ground war would get harder overnight. If they didn't, Japanese offensive plans in the region would take a beating. Kenny understood instantly. This was the test. On March 3rd, in a hot, smoky briefing room near Port Moresby, crews from the 90th Bomb Squadron leaned over a map of the Bismarck Sea. Grease pencils traced the convoy's projected path. Arrows from Allied bases showed where and when the attack waves would intersect. A staff officer ran through the plan. B-17s go in first from altitude, he said. Break up the formation. Force them to turn. Beaufighters hit next at mast height, rake the bridges and gun positions. Then our B-25s go in low, strafing run on the approach, skip bombing on the pullout. He let that sink in for a moment. You'll be flying through anything they have left that can still shoot. Someone at the back muttered, "So, just another quiet day." This time, the strained laughter stuck for a moment before dying out. Our focus, B-25, one of Gunn's commerce destroyers, taxied out into the haze a little later, nose pointed toward the sea. 8 forward-firing 50s were loaded to the feed lips. 2 500-pound bombs hung in the bay. The pilot wrapped his hand around the throttles, feeling the vibration climb as both engines roared up through their checks. There was no bombardier in the nose, no glass greenhouse, just a block of metal and guns, and a crew that knew their attack would happen within a few dozen feet of the waves. Hours later, the sky over the Bismarck Sea turned into a layered battlefield. High above, B-17s arrived first, bombing from altitude. Not to sink everything themselves, but to blow holes in the formation and force the convoy to maneuver. Columns of water and bursts of spray marked where their bombs fell. Then the Beaufighters came in, almost skimming the wave tops, cannons and machine guns, tearing into bridges and open gun positions, forcing Japanese crews to duck under steel and armor. Behind that chaos, the B-25 gunships dove in. From inside our Mitchell's cockpit, the target transport seemed to rush up to meet them. The pilot lined up the nose and opened fire. 8 Brownings spat streams of tracers down the deck, walking fire from bow to stern. Men on the ship scattered or fell. Gun mounts sparked and vanished in bursts of debris. Spray peppered the windscreen. The ship loomed larger. There was no room for second guessing. Bombs away! The pilot hit the release. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, through the side windows, the crew caught sight of 2 dark shapes skipping off the surface. Once, twice, and smashing into the ship's flank. The blast punched upward in a towering geyser of water, smoke, and twisted metal. The Mitchell jolted as the shock wave caught it. The pilot hauled back on the yoke, engines straining to drag the heavy bomber up and away from the expanding cloud. In the back, someone whooped over the intercom. No one was sure whether they were cheering the hit or the fact that they were still alive. They weren't the only ones. B-25s and A-20s all along the convoy were running the same deadly pattern, strafing runs, skip bombs, near misses, and direct hits. Some aircraft limped away. Some never came back. But one by one, Japanese transports took hits they couldn't survive. Destroyers burned and slowed, then stopped. By the end of March 3rd and into March 4th, the Bismarck Sea was streaked with oil and floating wreckage. The 8 transports were gone. 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk. The others were damaged and fleeing, rescuing survivors when they could. 12 ships in roughly 3 days. One impossible gunship was just a single participant in that storm, but together, the modified B-25s proved that Pappy Gunn's wild idea could change the course of a battle. News of the convoy's destruction spread quickly. In New Guinea, ground commanders suddenly faced fewer reinforcements across the lines. Later analysis showed what the wreckage already suggested. Thousands of troops and their supplies had gone down with those ships. An entire Japanese reinforcement plan had been gutted in a single air campaign. For the 5th Air Force, something else had changed. The old jokes about dropping eggs from 10,000 feet and hoping faded. Crews had seen what low-level gun-heavy attacks could do when practiced and coordinated. The Strafer B-25s and their A-20 cousins weren't oddities anymore. They were essential. On the other side of the Pacific, in offices far from the spray and flak, some of the same people who had dismissed guns' design now read the after-action reports. The unsafe nose-heavy Mitchells, the impossible modifications, had just helped erase 12 ships in one operation. Before long, factory-built Strafer versions of the B-25 rolled off assembly lines with gun noses and even heavier forward armament. What started as a field hack became official. From that point on, every Japanese convoy commander in the Southwest Pacific had to plan for a new threat. Bombers that might not appear as specks high overhead, but instead come roaring in at eye level, noses full of guns, with bombs that didn't fall, they skipped. Paul Pappy. Gunn didn't finish the war with a wall full of victory flags. He finished it as a legend among the men who flew his machines. Pilots talked about the wiry officer who could look at a damaged bomber and see a new kind of weapon hidden inside it. In aircrew bars and tent cities, his name became a shorthand for doing what the manuals said you couldn't. The Strafer B-25s he helped create left their fingerprints on future attack aircraft. Heavier forward firepower, aggressive low-level tactics, and the idea that sometimes the safest way through a threat is straight at it. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remained Exhibit A, that one impossible idea, pushed through by a handful of determined people, could tilt an entire campaign. In the end, it was a small fleet of modified bombers and one mechanic's stubborn dream that turned a Japanese convoy into a graveyard. Stories like this are drawn from wartime records and memoirs, with some dialogue and small details dramatized for the sake of storytelling. If you'd like to hear more forgotten World War II stories, innovations, and close calls, hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what we should cover next, and where in the world you're watching from.